Därför att det är ett sånt sällsynt vedervärdigt system. Att på grund av människors hudfärg döma dem till en mycket sämre tillvaro. Och det är en skam för världen så länge detta består.
Ja, det är mord på Sveavägen.
Det var en slakt. Och det var en slaktare. Det var bödeln som visste precis vad han ville.
Han blev inte skjuten som statsminister. Han blev skjuten som privatperson.
Polisen säger att mordet av allt att döma var mycket noga planlagt.
Och alla personer med walkie-talkies på varsin sida om Sveavägen som man hörde liksom.
Jag trodde att man i mordutredningar alltid gjorde bandade förhör med de väsentliga personerna som har funnits på platsen och som är viktiga.
Makalöst ointresse.
Det är klart att man försöker liksom suggerera sig fram till att få ihop bilderna om man nu var säker på att det var dem, så vill man ju få det att överensstämma med sitt eget vittnesmål.
När sanningen om det här kommer fram så kommer det svenska samhället att förändras i grunden.
Sydafrika, vilket jag personligen tycker är ett ganska intressant uppslag med tanke på att det är en ganska konkret motivbild. Det pratas mycket om Sydafrika och det är flera personer som har tagit kontakt med oss och haft intressanta synpunkter på det här uppslaget.
Fick Craig veta att Palme var nyckelpersonen i att ena sydafrikanska anti-apartheidrörelsen.
Det var min tanke och det har jag trott allt sedan dess.
I förra delen gick vi igenom detaljerna i vad som låg bakom mordet och att amerikanerna till slut tröttnade på Palmes smugglingar, hjälpen till Libyen bakom ryggen på amerikanerna. Men sedan även den personliga attacken på Arnold, som de värderar mycket högt i alla de roller han har haft genom åren. Vi lärde känna Arnold mer för att kunna värdera hans uppgifter och kunde konstatera att han till och med varit rådgivare åt den nuvarande presidenten i USA, Donald Trump. Vi redogörde ännu en gång för hur många av de hot som genomförts genom åren faktiskt i detalj stämmer väl, med rimliga orsaker och motiv för att personer kring utredningen skulle ge upp att försöka lösa fallet och att det handlade till stor del om pengar som motiv och att det då skulle handla om vapentillverkning och handel. För att låtsas och ge en bild av ett fredsälskande litet kallt land i norr förstår säkert alla att det Sverige bidrog med militärt inofficiellt var något helt annat. Som vi också kunde konstatera i årskrönikan 1987, alltså bara året efter mordet, så var nu relationerna med USA reparerade. JAS avtäcktes med pompa och ståt. För alla med insikt om vad som verkligen hade hänt kunde nu USA visa upp för hela världen, inklusive låta beslutsfattaren till mordet, enligt uppgiften från Chip, vara delaktig i när den nye statsministern Ingvar Carlsson kryper till korset och besöker Vita huset. Även det under pompa och ståt. USA var troligen mycket nöjda att visa upp för omvärlden hur man kan humsa, ett land som sticker upp som Palme och Sverige gjort tidigare. Sverige kan fortsätta sin Volvo-försäljning och stolta visa upp JAS för att kunna sälja in sitt nya stridsflygplan. Ska man fortsätta att spinna vidare på tesen om att titta på vilka som tjänade på en tragisk händelse, skulle man kunna tro att övriga sossar, svenska militärer och många andra var delaktiga i mordet med tanke på vad som hände sedan. Men det var de såklart inte, och här menar jag till och med att de kända citaten vi nämnde även är belägg för det.
I detta avsnitt kommer vi dock att ta vid tidsmässigt och fylla på med mer information kring just det. För om det under 1987 slickades röv i USA och Ingvar Carlsson troligen fick skaka hand med den som till och med beställt avrättningen på sin företrädare, så fanns det redan uppgifter i internationell press om vad som faktiskt låg bakom mordet. Det alla verkligen måste ha med sig in i detta är att fundera på vilken debatt som pågick i Sverige vid samma tid. Därför att ett drygt år efter mordet, i mars 1987, så skrevs en artikel i New York Times från en mycket känd och erkänd journalist, en Richard Reves, om vilka omständigheter som låg bakom mordet. En journalist som även en annan visselblåsare som arbetat för SIA, som jag fått förtroende för, hyllar som en mycket duktig och seriös journalist. Vi kommer in i artikeln vid tiden för Holmers attack i PKK-spåret. Vi kommer att läsa artikeln mer eller mindre i sin helhet, så får alla, i folkbildningens tecken, väga in själva vilken information som är relevant och viktig. Många av detaljerna kommer att ligga till grund för slutsatser senare. Som vanligt får ni helt förkasta alla officiella sanningar, även om vapen, kulor, oplanerat biobesök, håll mer i Borlänge och så vidare. Nu är ni ju helt vaccinerade mot de sagorna och kan bara ignorera dem som Palmesken-utredningen ville att ni skulle köpa i mörkläggningens tjänst. Som vanligt är det viktigt att skilja på korrekta premisser och de som skapats för att mörklägga. Det är dessa vi redan utrett av det verkliga materialet tidigare. Det hjälper oss alltså att i allt material vi går igenom avslöja relevant och irrelevant information. Ha också det i bakhuvudet när vi nu tar in vad Rickard skriver om i sin artikel. Gör ni det så kommer ni på samma sätt som mig att lätt kunna sålla bland 40 år gamla uppgifter.
The Palme Obsession, The Murder Sweden Can't Forget or Solve. By Richard Reeves. Richard Reeves's most recent book is The Reagan Detour. Published March 1st, 1987. Early on the morning of January 20th, 200 Swedish policemen surrounded a number of houses in Stockholm and rounded up 20 men. 3 of those arrested, the police announced, have been informed of the suspicion of being accessories to the murder of Olof Palme. The arrests climaxed an 11-month, $6 million effort by a 300-member task force investigating the killing of the man who had dominated his country's politics for 20 years. Prime Minister Palme had led his Social Democrats to victory in 3 elections and was the most important Swede in the world. But he had also led the party to its only 2 defeats in 56 years and, because he was a political animal who honed his words to wound, he was hated by many of his countrymen. 10 hours after the early morning arrests, the head of the investigation, Stockholm's police commissioner, Hans Holmer, and the chief prosecutor, Claes Ziem, appeared together before 250 reporters from 12 countries and announced to their stunned audience that the suspects had been released for lack of evidence. After that press conference, I walked from police headquarters around the corner to Ziem's office. "Do you know who killed Olof Palme?" I asked. "We haven't the faintest idea," he answered. "Do you know what kind of person did it?" "No." "Do you know where he came from?" "No." "Do you know why he did it?" "No." The answer to all those questions is no. Weeks later, as the first anniversary of the murder approached, the answers were still no. The only change was the removal of Holmer as chief of the task force. The details of Palme's assassination remain fresh in the memories of Sweden's 8.3 million people. At 11:21 on the night of February 28, 1986, a gunman stepped out of the shadows onto Sveavägen, a busy street in central Stockholm, fired 2 shots, then escaped. It took police more than 15 minutes to identify the victim as the Prime Minister, even though Lisbeth Palme, his wife, was screaming, "Don't you see who it is? They've shot my Olof." In the years since then, Sweden has been traumatized by the murder it can neither forget nor solve. As Swedes continue to come each day to lay roses on the site where Palme fell, half the country's law enforcement establishment is accusing the other half of arrogant bungling. The assassination and its fumbling, quarreling aftermath have shattered the prosperous little nation's self-image as a land of peace and decency, reason and competence. The truth may be far worse than the Swedish people know now or will ever know, if some high officials succeed in an apparent attempt to block certain lines of investigation. A month-long inquiry by this reporter, involving more than 100 interviews in Sweden and 4 other countries, produced strong evidence that police and prosecutors may have been restrained and perhaps misled by their own government, particularly the Foreign Ministry. While the police were chasing right-wing pamphleteers and a violent little gang of Kurdish communists, some Swedish authorities, including cabinet members, were coming to a more dangerous conclusion: that Palme died because of his clumsy involvement as a mediator in the Iran-Iraq war at the same time that Swedish arms makers were illegally shipping weapons to one side, Iran. The complicated and secret weapons dealings in many ways paralleled the controversial American transactions with Iran, and have raised the same kinds of questions about who in government knew what, and when. Regardless of who knew in Sweden, secret service agencies of other countries have offered the Swedish government information indicating that Palme's murder might be traced to his decision to block arms deliveries to Iran after illegal sales of surface-to-air missiles, howitzers and gunpowder became public in late 1985. Beyond that, some members of the cabinet have concluded that the subsequent death of a second Swedish official recorded as an accident by the police was probably a murder linked to the Palme investigation and the same arms transactions. That official was the Foreign Ministry officer responsible for approving all material exports, a former admiral named Carl Fredrik Algernon, who fell or was pushed in front of a subway train in Stockholm's central station on January 15, 6 days before he was to testify before a special prosecutor investigating the illegal arms shipments. "We were so naive," said one important Swedish official, who said his career could be ruined if it were known that we were meeting. "We thought we could interfere anywhere in the world without taking sides. Palme decided to take a higher profile, and now we are paying the price." "The truth about the murder?" said another Swedish official familiar with cabinet discussions, who also insisted on anonymity. "Most of the people in the government don't want it. It would be disastrous for the foreign ministry if people knew how stupid we have been in the Persian Gulf. The roots of the killing go back to Iran and Iraq. It is hard to say which one. Both had reasons. But the feeling is definitely not to find out. Chaos in Stockholm." Hans Holmer, like everyone else in Sweden, can remember exactly where he was when he learned Olof Palme was dead. He was on his way to a national ski race, staying at a small hotel 200 miles from Stockholm. He went downstairs for coffee just after 7 a.m. on March 1st to find a surprise clerk, who asked why he wasn't in the city. It took Holmer 5 hours to get to Sveavägen, where Palme had been walking after seeing a movie, with his wife but without bodyguards. Holmer returned to chaos. The police had not thought to close the bridges of Stockholm, which is a city of islands. Trains from the nearby central station were not stopped until 12:40 a.m., an hour and 19 minutes after Palme was killed by a bullet that passed from his back through his upper chest. The order to watch roads out of the city was issued after 12:50 a.m., and even then, no reason was given. Airports weren't closed down until 2:05 a.m. It was sometime after 1 a.m. before the commander of Sweden's armed forces was located and informed. The first piece of physical evidence, a bullet that had grazed Mrs. Palme, was found the next morning on the sidewalk more than 100 feet from the few square yards that had been cordoned off by police by an Indian journalist who said he was in a trance. The second bullet, the one that killed Palme, was found on March 2nd by a woman, one of thousands of Swedes bringing roses to the murder site. She picked it up beside a wastebasket, less than 30 feet from where Palme had fallen 37 hours before. Chief Holmer, though, was a reassuring figure. A rugged-looking man whom the press liked to compare to Clint Eastwood, he is the son of the country's best-known athletic figure, the Olympic track coach Gösta Holmer, and he had served as chief of SA with SPO, the National Security Police, before taking over the 4,000-man Stockholm department in 1976. He personally took charge of the investigation, operating from a heavily guarded palm room in police headquarters, and quickly produced a composite drawing of the suspected killer from the accounts of Mrs. Palme and 38 other witnesses. Holmer held daily press conferences, announcing on one day that the murder weapon must be a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, and on another that a partial license plate sighting had narrowed the search for a getaway car down to 200 vehicles. But within a week there were questions. The police said the killer had made his escape by running up a set of stairs and down 3 dark blocks before losing himself in the Friday night crowd on another main street. He could have made it in 2 minutes, they said. I was able to walk it in 3. But the key witness, an art student who did the rough sketch for the composite portrait, had seen the man she drew at least 15 minutes after the murder. Holmer himself, waving 2.357 Magnums before television cameras, said that the lead-tipped, copper-sheathed bullets were unique, probably handmade. But the bullets actually were copper-tipped and lead-sheathed, and reporters bought boxes of them at a sporting goods store 2 blocks from police headquarters. Then, on March 12th, less than 2 weeks after the killing, police arrested a 32-year-old man named Ake Gunnarsson, a loudmouthed, pamphlet distributing follower of the American extremist Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. The charge was complicity in the murder of Olof Palme. It seemed possible. Right-wingers in Sweden despised Palme. Some thought of him as a traitor to his class, a rich businessman's son who had become a socialist. Others, Gunnarsson vocal among them, thought Palme was selling out Sweden to the Soviet Union. Still, there was no real evidence against Gunnarsson, and the then prosecutor K.G. Svensson ordered him released within a week. Not for the last time, Holmer's task force started all over again. On March 29th, Swedish Air Force jets screamed back and forth all day 1,000 feet above Sveavigen, taking aerial photographs in search of the murder weapon. They were back the next day because there had been no film in one of the cameras. Then the investigators announced a plan to round up the 4,000.357 magnums in the country for extensive ballistic tests, giving up the idea only when West German experts said that the complex tests would take 10 years to complete. On May 6th, the police arrested Gunnarsson again. There is no evidence against this man, Svensson said. Svensson ordered Gunnarsson released, and then, because of his numerous disputes with Holmer, asked to be removed from the case. That's when Claes Ziem, Svensson's superior in the prosecutor's office, assigned himself to the case. Swedish criminal law is heavily weighted toward defendants' rights, and the police can hold individuals no longer than 12 hours without a certification of reasonable suspicion by a prosecutor. In practice, then, prosecutor and police are often adversaries, with the prosecutor responsible for protecting the rights of suspects, a situation that in this case would lead to a struggle between Holmer and Ziem that divided much of the nation. Moreover, in Sweden, almost all officials are totally autonomous. Laws against ministerial influence go back to the 17th century. Not even the Prime Minister has the power to give direct orders to police or prosecutors. So, when Ingvar Carlsson, Palme's successor and former deputy, made his first comment on the investigation that he was disappointed, no one was particularly surprised when, on July 8th, Holmer went on television to respond, "We don't need praise, but we don't need to be rocketed either." It seems ungrateful. The Prime Minister did not offer his opinion in public again for more than 6 months. But no Swede could be blamed for wondering what was going on. The news was sometimes distressing, sometimes comic. The security police, Säpo, had been investigating tips that Stockholm policemen were behind the murder without ever informing Holmer. The national police had let a bank robber out of prison because he said he could lead them to Palme's killers. Within an hour the prisoner had escaped from them, and soon enough, was robbing banks again. A Kurdish connection? At the end of July, Hans Holmer was back on television, announcing progress of great importance. Leaks from headquarters produced newspaper reports that the police knew the motive and the murderer. There are a lot of news leaks in Sweden, where freedom of the press laws make it a crime for officials or employers to try to find the source of leaked information. Holmer, he gave the order to kill and police accuse, "You are the killer" were two of the headlines that appeared. The press was following what Holmer was calling the main trail, the theory that Palme had been killed by members of the secretive Kurdish Workers' Party, called by its Kurdish initials, PKK, a violent band of refugees from eastern Turkey who had been invited to settle in Sweden because of the country's official encouragement of national liberation movements. Kurds began coming to Sweden in the 1960s, political refugees complaining of suppression by the governments of Turkey, Iran and Iraq. There are about 18 million Kurds in all, concentrated in the mountain area called Kurdistan, where Turkey, Iran, Iraq, the Soviet Union and Syria border one another. For 1 year at the end of World War II, they had their own autonomous republic. Most of it has since become part of Turkey, and the Turks assert that there are no such people as Kurds, just mountain Turks. The Marxist-Leninist PKK may have as few as 16 actual members among the 7,000 or so Kurds living in Sweden. The PKK's presence among the Svartskallar, the derogatory Swedish term for all unblonde, un-Nordic immigrants that means, literally, blackheads, became politically visible in 1983, when Sweden denied an entry visa to the group's leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who was living in Damascus, Syria. Not long after that, 2 former PKK members were murdered in Stockholm and Uppsala, and the Swedish government officially designated the group a terrorist organization. 9 PKK members were officially expelled from Sweden, but that order was immediately set aside because sending them back to Turkey would be tantamount to executing them. 2 Kurds have been subsequently convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the Stockholm and Uppsala murders. According to police, within these events are to be found the motivation for and some of the people involved in the murder of Olof Palme. Although the circumstantial evidence against the PKK has not been released, the Holmer team claimed to me that this is what they know. Asterisk wiretaps on PKK telephones in the weeks before the murder revealed plans for a wedding code for killing, but there was no indication of who the victim would be. Asterisk the murder weapon, which has never been found, was purchased by a petty narcotics dealer and then transferred to a member of the PKK. Asterisk the man who pulled the trigger came to Sweden from Belgium and was waiting in a PKK bookstore and cafe 2 blocks from Svivagen when word came that the Palmes were walking along the street. That man, police believe, is probably now in Damascus. One of the more interesting things about the police theory is that 2 of the alleged plotters were actually in jail at the time of the Palme killing, one for murder and one for narcotics dealing. But most Swedish prisoners get days off on weekends, and police say the 2 men handled the weapons transactions on a Saturday, February 15, 1986. That's what Holmer concluded in late July. He still believes it, even after his removal from the investigation. Through it all he was extremely popular, receiving from appreciative citizens dozens of bouquets and pounds of chocolate every day. Swedish television named him Man of the Year. A popular magazine voted him one of the 10 sexiest men in Sweden. With Hussein Yildirim, a lawyer who spoke for the PKK, taunting him daily in the newspapers, Holmer stuck doggedly to the main trail, basically ignoring other leads. Tips involving military officers or other right-wingers were avoided after the Gunnarsson embarrassment. When I asked police whether they had considered the possibility that Palme had been killed for something that had nothing to do with official duties, I was told it was a Nordic ethic to stay away from a man's private zone, meant as a euphemism for other women. The press, sensationalistic as it was on other subjects, followed that ethic as well, refusing to print the name of Emma Rothschild, a British scholar and writer whose close friendship with Palme has been the subject of speculation in British and American newspapers. Clay Ziem, the chief prosecutor, called the PKK theory police disinformation, but he encouraged Holmer to test the theory, which led to the arrests of Yildirim and 19 other men, most of them Kurds, on the morning of January 20th. With the release of all 20 later that day, Ziem had, in effect, brought down Sweden's Man of the Year. Prime Minister Carlson, facing calls from the opposition for parliamentary inquiries into the investigation, finally mustered enough ministerial influence, or was finally comfortable enough with the hypocrisy of breaking law and tradition to replace Holmer on February 4th with Holger Romander, the chief of the National Police. Romander then pledged to follow all leads, not one main theory to the exclusion of others. A national trauma. So, a year after Palme's death, the nation is back on Svivagen. They are still coming to lay roses on the spot where he fell, aren't they? Said Dieter Strand, a popular newspaper columnist and author of a biography of Palme. Americans tend to compare this with John Kennedy's assassination, the end of innocence. But the real comparison is Pearl Harbor. It was the end of our isolation. They reached us here in the far north. It was not that Palme was so popular. He evoked both the love and the hate that characterize a dominant public figure. Swedish politics for 20 years was pro-Palme, anti-Palme, or just Palme, said Carl Bildt, the leader of the opposition moderate party. If any man was going to be shot, it was him, said Strand. He divided people, found their differences and exploited them. There are men who can make thoroughbreds nervous so they run their best. Olof did that to other men. Olof was un-Swedish, said one of his closest friends, Harry Schein, who fled Austria in 1938 and made a life as one of Sweden's richest men, president of the National Investment Bank and chairman of the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation. He was too international, too fast. And he was in love with his own language, which made him go too far. The hate added to the trauma, Schein continued. So many people hated him, and they thought the killing must have come from their hate. The guilt. In America, we knew the great Palme, the generous Palme, the world figure, said Christer Stendahl, the Bishop of Stockholm of the Church of Sweden, who came home in 1984 after 35 years in the United States, 10 of them as Dean of Harvard School of Divinity. He was diminished at home. Small, sardonic, irritating. Shrunk in the straitjacket of Swedish bloc politics. But whatever Swedes think of any individual, Bishop Stendahl went on, they have always trusted power and the authorities. They expect things to work. Expectations are much higher than in the United States. When they don't work, as they haven't spectacularly in this case, there is a real danger of erosion of the foundations of Swedish life. This is a very frightening time for people here. Learning the truth about what happened could be even more frightening. Many Swedes don't want to know, for them it's over. There seems to be no thirst for or need of revenge. That may be the ultimate Swedish decency. Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson, an unobtrusive party and government functionary his whole life, has united most of the country or calmed it. According to one poll, the Social Democrats have gone up 10 points in popularity since Palme's death. Neither are the friends of Olof Palme driven by a desire for revenge or vindication. His story is over, said Dieter Strand, his biographer. I heard similar lines elsewhere. I could never be quoted on this, but I hope they never find the murderer, said a friend in the current government. It would trivialize Olof's life, vulgarize it. He would have to share history with a crazed assassin. Foreign intrigue. Then there's the powerful group, few and highly placed, including some in the foreign ministry and members of the current cabinet, who do not believe the assassin was crazy at all. Such people obviously would not speak for the record, but a half-dozen in high positions expressed the belief and the fear that the truth might destroy confidence in both the government and the Social Democratic Party. They believe Olof Palme and Admiral Carl Fredrik Algernon, too, were murdered because of Sweden's official and unofficial, well-meaning and profit-seeking, meddling in the Persian Gulf War. The Foreign Ministry, acting officially, stood between the police and any investigation that might have international implications. When approached by the police about information from foreign intelligence sources on an Iranian connection, the Foreign Ministry responded, "That is not plausible to this office." When other foreign sources pointed to Iraq, the police inquiry was limited to a search of hotel records to determine whether anyone holding an Iraqi passport had registered during the week before the murder. The trail of events that was effectively closed to investigators began in November 1980. Olof Palme, who had been defeated in the 1976 election, was bored and irritable as opposition leader. He missed the world spotlight that had played on him as a vehement opponent of the Vietnam War. He jumped when United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim asked him to try to mediate the bloody war between Iran and Iraq, then a year old. Until 1983, the year after he won re-election as Prime Minister, Palme continued to make trips to Iran and Iraq, shuttling between Tehran and Baghdad with an entourage from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Many of those diplomats stayed on in the warring capitals. Their presence led to the later suspicion that the government must have known of weapons shipments to Iran by Sweden's great arms manufacturer, the Bofors Group of Nobel Industries. Swedish law prohibits sales by Bofors and other private arms companies in war zones, which by Swedish definition includes much of the world, certainly the Persian Gulf and the entire Middle East. But Sweden is also a country that maintains its high standard of living. Per capita income is 25% higher than in the United States through foreign trade. Arms sales are part of that prosperity. Weapons may account for 5% or more of Sweden's annual exports of about $45 billion, which is more than a third of its gross national product. The government has been known to look the other way on weapons sales, liberally granting export permits that certified that material was not headed for war zones. Singapore was the favored shipping point for Bofors equipment, especially its highly regarded RBS-70 surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile launcher. From that port, the RBS-70s were sent on to, among other places, Iran, being transshipped a second time from Dubai or Bahrain. Then someone inside Bofors blew the whistle, leaking information on the deals to peace groups on the left wing of Palme's Social Democrats. Details began to leak out about a series of shipments between October of 1984 and May of 1985, apparently all headed toward Iran. Trainloads of Bofors gunpowder had been seized by customs officers in West Germany and Italy. Other trainloads and perhaps naval cannons had gotten through by way of Austria, Yugoslavia, and Singapore. 200 RBS-70s had been delivered to Iran, part of an order for 400 placed by the Iranian government. An additional 800 to 1,200 RBS-70s could not quite be accounted for, although they were known to have passed through Dubai and Bahrain. Directors of Bofors have insisted that the company has done nothing that was illegal or that was not known to the government. Palme, facing re-election in 1985, appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the sales. And he stopped the shipments at least for a time. Specifically, he blocked the 200 additional RBS-70s that Iran had ordered. Also, according to sources in the French Foreign Ministry, the Swedish Prime Minister ordered a ship loaded with 155mm howitzers stopped as it was leaving the port of Malmö bound for Dubai, and then, it is believed, Iran. An Iranian military delegation came to Stockholm to protest the stopping of deliveries. That was on February 4, 1986, 3 weeks before Palme's murder. The Iraqis, of course, had protested the sales when they became public. They were also enraged by a program that the Swedes considered an act of humanitarian neutrality. Iranian war wounded were being treated in Swedish hospitals for what the Iranians said were the effects of poison gas attacks launched by Iraq. The arms investigation continued after Palme's assassination and eventually centered on the Inspector of War Material, Admiral Algernon. His testimony was scheduled for January 21st. He was working on it January 15th. His death that day was big news. Police initially said there were witnesses who had seen a man with his hands on Algernon's chest, but only one newspaper bothered to speculate on its possible connection with Palme's killing. Dagens Nyheter, the independent morning daily, said, continued on page 82, in an editorial 3 days later, on Sunday, in less than a year, both the country's prime minister and the official responsible for weapons export control have suffered violent deaths. There has been speculation about illegal arms transfers to Iran. Events in the United States have shown that a shadow world does exist and that what made Palme vulnerable should not be ruled out of any investigation. The next day, the police announced that witnesses, there were at least 2 who said that Algernon was pushed in front of the train, were mistaken. The case was closed. Algernon's name disappeared from the press. But it did not disappear from cabinet concerns. Ministers were relieved by the police finding, but many did not believe it. The murder, and that was the word used by ministers, was discussed by the cabinet. The concern there is that it was part of a continuing threat to the nation that must be resolved. Not solved, but resolved. We have had 2 political murders in a year, I was told after that meeting. The question now is whether they were linked, and which man or woman among us might be next. A political assassination is, after all, a political event, a circumstance to be managed by politicians. The men and women who succeed in that business are the ones most skilled in handling and shaping public perceptions of the events of the day. After February 28, 1986, Olof Palme's murder was yesterday's event. The Prime Minister was dead, and there was nothing his staff, one of whom became his successor, could do about that. One of those men, sitting in his office in Rosenbad, the seat of Sweden's government, looked out over Stockholm one recent morning and put it this way: "We know at this point that there is less than a 10% chance to solve the murder. That is not our problem. Our problem is what the people of Sweden believe happened and how they deal with that. That leader does not know who pulled the trigger that ended Olof Palme's life. I could find no one who does. What I did find in Rosenbad, and in other government offices, was national leadership determined to protect Sweden's critical international relationships and trade, as well as the standing of the government with its own people. Politically, solving yesterday's murder might not be worth the trouble it would cause today. All we want now is for this to be over with, one way or another, said the man in Rosenbad. We must get it behind us."
En lång artikel, men väldigt detaljrik. Med faktiska siffror och tidpunkter, som vi framöver ska använda för att försöka lägga tidspussel och kanske förstå genom det vad som kan ha hänt under resans gång. Som ni läser så pekar allting på att det skulle ha med illegal vapenexport att göra. Och det som är så bra i uppgifterna är att Rickard Reves verkligen lyfter fram hur viktig som vapenexport var för Sverige vid tiden för mordet. Hoppas nu att alla kan smälta denna massa och förstå att förklaringarna bakom mordet har funnits framme väldigt länge. I alla fall i internationell media. Det är bara i Sverige som vi blivit bedragna och lurade under så många år. Som ni även hörde så är även andra inblandade personer möjliga offer för Sveriges vapenhandel. Och Algernon är en sådan. Vi kommer att framöver återkomma till honom i andra uppgifter. Fundera verkligen på vilken information som fanns i svensk media vid denna tidpunkt. Det var PKK, Holmers avgång och en massa annat strunt. Samtidigt, lyssna på just det som denna journalist fångar in så bra i nyanserna. Politisk, kanske det inte är värt att lösa gårdagens mord idag. Och allt vi vill nu är att det här ska gå över, en väg eller en annan. Vi måste lägga det bakom oss, skulle en man i Rosenbad ha sagt. Stämmer inte det väldigt bra med Ingvar Carlssons senare agerande under 1987? Kan ni nu också förstå att, i en väg eller en annan, i involverade att peka ut i svenska ensamma galningar, är de efterkommande 39 åren?
Förstår ni inte att locket lades på vad som hände redan under mordnatten? Locket officiellt med det svenska dubbelspelet lades på redan året efter när Carlsson slickade röv i Vita huset. Hur några år senare USA och Sverige skulle ordna upp saker i Sydafrika tillsammans. Hur bra blev det i Sydafrika många år senare? Är det nu lättare att förstå att det locket lades på om Sydafrikas inblandning i Palmemordet? Precis det som förklarar den vändning som skedde mellan februari och juni innan Palmemords skenutredningen lades ner 2020. Hur vi redan sedan mordnatten blivit presenterade ensamma galningar och andra villospår för att mörklägga bakgrunden till mordet. En annan del man verkligen kan reagera på i artikeln är det tidiga användandet av uttrycket "vi har varit så naiva". Som en svensk officiell person sa, att de trodde att de kunde blanda sig in i saker runt om i världen utan att välja sida. Palme var den som beslutade att hålla en hög profil och nu betalar vi priset för det. Detta är ju naiva i begrepp som verkar vara något som har fortplantats och tagit spinn i svenska politikers vokabulär redan sedan den tiden. Var det en del av den egentliga svenska oskulden som försvann på mordnatten? Hoppas alla förstår att det låtsasneutrala Sverige med hög moralisk svansföring internationellt under så många år har varit delaktig och orsakat otroligt mycket skada som inte ens befolkningen i det egna landet har fått veta eller tagit del av under alla år. Förstår ni inte att ett krigshetsande militärt styre utanför Sveriges gränser, även dessa dagar, påverkar den egna befolkningens säkerhet? Ska vi sedan få höra om denna naivitet i ännu en gång när vi provocerar och dras in i nya konflikter, trots att vi varit med om samma resa tidigare? Vi smälter all denna viktiga information till nästa avsnitt, när vi fortsätter analysera detaljerna och använder uppgifterna för att om möjligt försöka förstå vad som kan ha hänt innan mordet.